Tonight, wanted on terror charges in the US, this British man has spent 8 years in a high-security prison fighting extradition. We have an unprecedented interview from behind bars in which he asked the British government to put him on trial here.
I would urge the Director of Public Prosecutions to please put me on trial in this country and to find out what has gone wrong in my case.
Good evening. This week, the political debate has been around secret courts, email surveillance, and issues of justice, human rights, and now extradition. We begin the programme with the case of Babar Ahmad, who has spent 8 years in jail fighting extradition to the United States on terror charges. Next Tuesday, the European Court of Human Rights will rule on his case and others. Following an unprecedented High Court battle, the BBC won the right to interview him in prison. Here's Dominic Kashani.
He's the longest-serving British prisoner in jail, never convicted of a crime. The US authorities are fighting to extradite him, claiming he ran extremist websites to support the global jihad. In days, he will find out his fate. In an exclusive interview from prison, Babar Ahmad tells Newsnight he's been denied justice by the British authorities.
I would urge the Director of Public Prosecutions to please put me on trial in this country and to find out what has gone wrong in my case. There has been a serious and unprecedented abuse of process that has gone on in my case.
For opponents of the extradition treaty with the US, this case highlights how unfair that treaty is.
A British citizen banged up in a high-security prison in his 8th year, without trial, without charge. That is a Kafkaesque situation here happening on British soil. I think this case shames us all.
Babar Ahmad is the man the government said we couldn't meet. But the BBC challenged ministers in the High Court, and judges said it was in the public interest to hear his story from Long Lartin Prison in Worcestershire. He's been held on a special unit for half a dozen men. Each of them is accused of being among the most dangerous extremists in the world, and in a few days' time the European Court of Human Rights will deliver one of its most important judgments. Can men like Babar Ahmad be extradited to the United States? And when did they actually interview you?
I think the first interview was, the next day.
He was first arrested in 2003 in a Scotland Yard counter-terrorism operation. Officers were briefed that he was providing logistical and financial support to terrorists abroad through a website he'd allegedly set up. But days later he was released without charge and accused the police of assaulting him.
So you see that the air is very swollen and I had bleeding in that air. Just another shot. I was punched all over my body, I was kneed, handcuffs were placed on my wrists and they were slid until I was screaming in agony. They took me in the van and for the next 20 minutes there was more abuse, punches, more abuse of the handcuffs until my throat became dry from screaming.
Last year, 4 police officers were prosecuted for assault and acquitted. The trial came after the Met admitted the assault happened and paid Babar Ahmad £60,000 in damages. I asked Babar Ahmad if he agreed with the Americans that this video had a sole purpose. They say that that material was used to recruit people for violent jihad, and that's why they want to put you on trial.
If there was anything on there that broke any law of the United Kingdom, or if there was anything in there that was wrong, I don't understand for the last 16 years where the police and Crown Prosecution Service have been.
But it's just a question of taste. It's just a question of taste and decency.
Well, something like that is a war crime. Obviously, I don't support wanton killing of captured prisoners of war.
Did you run the Exam.com website, as the Americans allege?
The right place for me to respond to all of the allegations against me is in a court of law, and that is why I call upon the Crown Prosecution Service to put my heart at rest and to put everyone else's heart at rest, and please put me on trial in this country.
Babar Ahmad is a British citizen who grew up in a middle-class family in South London. As a teenager, he became sickened by events in Bosnia. He revealed to Newsnight that he joined a volunteer brigade of the Bosnian army and fought against the Serbs.
Here were defenseless people to whom horrific things were happening, and everyone was just sitting, and the international community were having conferences and negotiations and talks. No one was really actually doing anything to stop the slaughter of the innocents.
Bosnia was a turning point for some British Muslims. Al-Qaeda later tapped into the anger it caused, but Babar Ahmad denies he ever supported Osama bin Laden's jihad.
Well, if by jihad you mean defending yourself and your home and your family, then of course I support that, as every human being should have the right to defend their home and their family and themselves. But if by that one means attacking innocent people or blowing up nightclubs or violence for political means, then I don't support that.
After 9/11, everything changed for the man from Tooting in South London. MI5 installed a secret listening device in his home, and the Americans were slowly building their case. Investigators were alerted by a tip-off from a company tucked away in a quiet corner of Connecticut. Days after 9/11, staff at this web hosting company contacted the American authorities. They were concerned about allegedly extremist material found on one of the websites hosted here. That website was azam.com. US investigators say the records here show the website was operated from Imperial College London, and that's where Babar Ahmad worked.
This is a serious allegation that has been made against me. I've never been questioned about this allegation. I've never been shown the evidence against me.
The alleged crimes were on computers in London, but the website was based in America. And it's this question over where he should be tried that's at the heart of Babar Ahmad's battle. The Crown Prosecution Service decided in 2004 he couldn't face trial, but the CPS has told Newsnight that it only saw a small number of documents seized by British police. Babar Ahmad says the rest of the evidence was sent directly to the US.
So this was the resolution that was...
That allegation has led to questions in Parliament, including questions about the role played by the Metropolitan Police.
I would love to know exactly what happened to the evidence that they collected. How much of that was given to the CPS? How much of it went directly to the United States? Why did it go directly to the United States? Who asked for that to happen? I think there's a whole grey area here, very, very murky, and we need to get to the bottom of it, which is why I've called for a public inquiry.
The Metropolitan Police say they carried out their investigation strictly in accordance with UK law. We completely reject any suggestion of impropriety. Babar Ahmad is appealing for an 11th hour review of his files. His lawyers have compiled a dossier on the evidence that could be used against him in Britain. They say other men have been prosecuted for similar crimes, including for having material that began life on Azam. So if they charge you with fundraising for terrorism?
I would happily stand trial for anything that the Crown Prosecution Service decided to charge me with, because I wish to clear my name, I wish to get my life back.
If convicted, he faces life in this maximum security prison in Colorado. His lawyers say conditions there are inhumane. This is the core issue that the European Court of Human Rights will rule on next week. If judges say he can't be extradited, the British authorities face a dilemma about what to do with him.
I just try my best to take each day as it comes.
Either way, for Babar Ahmad, the clock is ticking.
I'm fighting for my life, and I'm running out of time. In a way, this interview is my last chance to try and convince the authorities here to end my nightmare by putting me on trial in this country.
To debate Britain's extradition treaty with the US is David Birmingham, one of the so-called NatWest or Enron 3, whose book The Price to Pay has just been published. Also Mike O'Brien QC, who was Solicitor General in the last government, and Tory MP Dominic Raab, who has campaigned for reform. Do you think, Dominic Raab, at the moment, it is dangerous now to talk about crimes Committee Without Borders? Because indeed, Crimes Committee Without Borders is very hard to decide where prosecution can take place.
Well, that's a sort of abstract academic question. I think at the moment there are two fundamental problems. First of all, British citizens in this country will not have the evidence against him looked at by a judge in the same way as it happens in the US. That is crystal clear.
But what about Babar Ahmad? He's been 8 years in a high security prison without charge in the United Kingdom.
Absolutely.
Does that speak to justice?
Absolutely not. It's absolutely reprehensible. The other issue, the idea of having anyone held in pre-charge detention for 7 or 8 years is wrong in principle. If they're guilty, they should be prosecuted. If they're not, they should be let free. The other problem is forum, where you've got these cross-border cases, which I think is the point you're making. Look, the US offers this kind of forum arrangement to other countries, or even stronger protections for their citizens. So when you've got a cross-border case, that ought to be decided not by haggling prosecutors behind closed door, but by in open court according to legal principles set by the UK Parliament.
So it came in under a Labour government. Let's talk about Babar Ahmad before we talk about this forum. Is it justifiable to have a man in the United Kingdom in jail for 8 years without charge?
No. That's much too long, and the system needs to operate much more effectively, and I do think that there needs to be some changes in it.
Should there be a forum for deciding, an independent forum for deciding where the alleged crime took place?
Well, I think that's a much more complicated issue. Of course, there is legislation in 2006 which tried to insert into the law an issue of forum, as they call it, where the case should be tried, with the idea that defendants should be able to be tried in the UK if that's where the most significant part of the offence occurred. And that is, of course, what some people want. However, the problem is that's not where the witnesses may be, it's not where the victims may be, and it's not where the investigation probably took place.
So why did they not bring it into force?
And therefore, it is the case that I think forum needs to be looked at, and I think there is an argument for a change on it. However, not the change that was in the 2006 Act, which was not brought into law.
Witnesses is actually a man or woman's chance of freedom or conviction. That should be the primary reason for having the trial, where it should be most efficacious.
I think what we're looking at with extradition is an issue of arrest. What is the criteria on which you arrest someone, not what is the criteria on which you convict someone. That's entirely different.
Well, David Birmingham, you were part of this system, and it would have been seen that the system worked. You were extradited, you pled guilty, you did the time, you're back now. That was extradition working.
Well, undoubtedly the extradition worked because we were extradited.
And then you pled guilty.
Yes, indeed. We did what 98% of people indicted in the federal system in the US do, and we entered into a plea bargain and got ourselves home. It was a business decision we took. It was the right decision in the circumstances. I think the issue, and particularly with this case, and it has striking parallels not only with our case but also with a terrifying case of a guy called Lotfi Raisi, is that there is no, as you yourself have identified, there is no ability for a judge to take a reasoned look at all the circumstances and say, hang on a minute, given all of the circumstances of this case, and this is what we argued about ours, this ought to be heard, this ought more properly to be heard here.
But in terms of conditions, and we heard one of the Babar Ahmad, the whole point is going to the European Court of Human Rights because they say the inhumane conditions means that he would not have his human rights. Yeah. What's your attitude to that? Of course, you were not in a supermax prison.
I was not. I mean, I think the mere fact that the European Court of Human Rights has taken as long as it has to look at these suggests that there is a real issue. I mean, there is no doubt that this is not a secret that in AdMax Florence in Colorado, people are in solitary confinement for years, many years, 20 years in some cases. They never see another human being.
Now, one inquiry has said, the Lord Baker inquiry said, the system works perfectly well. Of course, David Cameron and Barack Obama talked about it. Clegg has talked about an independent inquiry. But is it worth upsetting the relationship with the United States when the point about terrorism is one that is very well made all over the world and is a global issue?
Look, the extradition arrangements for terrorist offences and serious crime are vitally important, which is precisely why you don't want the relationship soured by lots of these cases which are becoming a thorn in our side because there's no fairness to it. I mean, I find Mike O'Brien's position utterly untenable. They brought in a lousy deal, and then in 2006 they part-corrected it by enacting in law this forum test, but he's now opposing bringing it into force. I can't understand that.
So do you think the Tory government is going to change it?
I hope so.
So
and the House of Commons has unanimously called for both the US and EU extradition arrangements be reformed. I think that's got to be taken into account.
But what would that do to the relation? Because in fact, you heard the Americans, you heard Louis Sussman, who's the ambassador here, saying this works well, there is no need to change it.
With the greatest of respect, the principled position of the United States government is that they are more than happy to support their request for extradition with evidence. They have 130 treaties worldwide. There are only 3 in which they don't produce evidence. France, who don't extradite their own citizens to the US, full stop. Ireland, who will not extradite if the crime could be deemed to have been committed in Ireland. And us. That's it. So there's no issue with the US saying we don't want to give evidence. They happily will. We gave this up, the Labour government did, back in 2003.
I'm afraid Dominic's misrepresented my position. My position is that we do need to see some change. I think there is a political crisis in relation to this legislation rather than a legal one. The problem is not only that we've got Babar Ahmad and his long detention, also the McKinnon case, which has raised serious concerns, but also the government has come in and said this legislation is imbalanced. It favors the US. I think that's arguable, but what we've now got is, of course, Dominic Grieve, no mean lawyer, saying actually it's not imbalanced anymore. We've listened to Scott Baker's report and we think it's not imbalanced. But I actually think there's therefore a crisis of confidence in this legislation which must be addressed by the government, whether that's by trying to renegotiate the treaty with the US, that will be difficult, and with the EU partners, because there are much the same legislation in place. That is a big problem that they now got.
The crisis of confidence is not enough for the legislation to be changed itself. Surely it's about imbalance if it does indeed exist.
Absolutely.
I'm not convinced that the argument that Dominic Grieve now puts that there's an equality there is right. Well, I actually think that the argument that Dominic puts
will this treaty be here in 2 years' time?
Well, I think the treaty will, but we extradite 5 British citizens for every one that comes this way. We need reform. We don't want to tear up the treaty. We want a balanced, common sense system.
Thank you all very much indeed.